Hello, book lovers! I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Penn Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of really exciting books and authors coming your way this season. Next week, I talk to Rob Franklin about his new book, Great Black Hope. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on the show, my guest is Emma Pattee, and we are discussing her brand new debut novel, Tilt. Emma, welcome. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm really excited to be here.
Tilt is speculative fiction. It starts with a devastating earthquake in Portland, Oregon. When it happens, Annie, the main character, is 37 weeks pregnant and shopping for a crib. She survives the earthquake and stumbles outside. From there, we follow her for 24 hours as she walks across Portland to find her husband, to find whatever is left of her life. In raw, honest prose, we bounce between the present and the past. We learn about Annie and her husband Dom, how they met and fell in love. Annie dreamt of becoming a famous playwright. Dom wanted to be a famous actor. None of that happened. Annie and Dom are now struggling financially and creatively. And as I read, the question I kept asking and the characters kept asking was, now what? And even more pressing, can we start over? Is it ever too late? The book feels raw and real in a way most books don't. The depictions of pending motherhood, marriage, and the chaos from the big earthquake were terrifying and oddly grounding because they were so human. Emma made me feel like I was listening to a best friend spill her deepest, darkest secrets. A best friend admitting how scared she was, how many mistakes she'd made. A friend saying things I'm not sure I've ever actually heard anyone say out loud before. But maybe they should, because they're frighteningly real, and I just could not put this book down. Emma, this book feels like a whispered confession, like I'm listening to my best friend tell her deepest, darkest secrets. Will you read for us? Will you introduce us to this best friend, Annie?
Yeah, of course. And I had found another page to read, but now that was such a lovely take on the book. I almost want to read something more personal. This is Annie. This is the second page of the book, and she's at IKEA. She's shopping for a crib, and she's very pregnant. She's too pregnant to be shopping for a crib, if those of you who have been pregnant know what I mean by that. I'd been standing in the kids section for at least an hour, trying to decide between the different crib mattresses. Because of course a crib does not come with a mattress. What was I thinking? That you were going to sleep directly on the wood? So now I'm Googling the difference between a spring mattress and a foam mattress. And Google tells me that it can be worth it to spend the extra money on an organic crib mattress because toxins cause cancer. And if you're going to get a foam mattress, make sure it's made without polyurethane. But of course, IKEA does not list on their website what kind of foam their crib mattresses are made of. Or if they do, I can't find it. And I'm looking for somebody in a yellow shirt to help me, but they've all vanished. Your father and I sleep on a mattress we got on Craigslist, a mattress we dragged together through the dingy hallway of a dingy apartment building in North Portland after handing some creepy guy $80 in cash. Queen bed for my queen, your father said, when we finally managed to squeeze it into the back of our car. It's not just our mattress, Bean. It's everything. Your father, Dom, is 38, still trying to get that big role, still standing in line to audition, still sending his headshots to casting agents, still picking up shifts at the cafe that he's worked at since we first met. Your mother, Annie, speaking, thought she was destined to be the next Tennessee Williams, the millennial Beckett, wasted hours practicing that big sweeping bow she'd do under those big Broadway lights, and now is 35 and spends her days staring at spreadsheets on a computer screen on the 22nd floor of a glass building, pressing buttons with her fingers. Last I checked, your father and I have $836 in a checking account at Wells Fargo, a Subaru with 160,000 miles on it, and a 2-bedroom apartment by Mount Tabor we can only afford because the landlord feels too guilty to raise our rent or kick us out. And here I am, 37 weeks pregnant at IKEA. on a Monday. With a credit card, I'll probably die before I pay off. What I'm trying to say is that nothing about the first year of your life will look like the years that come after. So enjoy your toxin-free mattress while you can.
Emma, thank you for reading from your brand new debut, Tilt. You put us right into Annie's mind, into her stream of consciousness. She's 37 weeks pregnant. She's standing in IKEA. And I understand that this idea came to you while you were standing in an IKEA. Tell me about that, how this idea came to you.
Yeah, it's funny, people often ask I think because I'm a climate journalist, people sort of would expect that this idea came to me a little bit more strategically, that I wanted to talk about, some broader themes of climate and capitalism and sort of environmental disrepair, and that I chose this. Then that's just not at all what happened. I was very pregnant, too pregnant to be shopping for a crib. I would doubt I was shopping for a crib. I bought a crib used. I think I was even too cheap to buy a new crib. And I was at IKEA and, I was loading something onto something and the building started to shake. And I thought, like, this is the big one, which is the Cascadia earthquake that here in the Pacific Northwest we're all waiting on. And I really was so terrified in that moment and sort of felt like, how am I gonna get home? And I can't believe I'm pregnant. Like, what am I gonna do to protect my kid? And then, of course, it wasn't a big earthquake. It was like a loading truck backing up to the building or something. And kind of as soon as the shaking stopped, the idea for the book was really in my mind, almost fully formed.
Wow. And then when did you start the book? Did you just run home and start writing?
So, I was 7 months pregnant and everyone was like, "Don't start working on a book right now. It's okay, like, give it a minute." But I really couldn't let it go, and I now know more of myself as a writer that that's just an authentic, like, y and I think a lot of writers are like this. You really cannot let something go when it's, like, eating at you. So I wrote the first chapter, what I just read from, when my child was about 8 weeks old. So within a few months, I was working on the book.
So you're standing in IKEA and you're thinking, "This is the big earthquake." And then in the book, Annie, your character in your book, Tilt, is experiencing the actual big earthquake. And you just mentioned this was the big Cascadia earthquake that you're all waiting for in Portland, Oregon. And that's so foreign to me. I can't even imagine, like, is everyone in Portland just walking around saying, "When's it coming? When's it coming?" Like, can you talk about this? Tell me about this earthquake.
Yes, off the coast of Oregon, there is a really large fault line, and it runs up from Northern California through Oregon, through Washington, and into British Columbia. And, many of you listening probably remember that there was a 2015 article in the New Yorker, which went on to win the Pulitzer, which was called the Very Big One. And it was sort of bringing to the public eye the awareness of this massive earthquake, which is predicted. Right now, there's a 37% chance that this earthquake will happen in the next 50 years. And what scientists say is that when it does happen, it will likely be the worst natural disaster in the history of North America. So this is a really serious concern. And I do think many, many people living, as I now having written a book about the earthquake, I am very aware that many, many people living around here have a lot of earthquake anxiety. And there are also many, many people living in the Pacific Northwest who have moved here and they have never heard of the earthquake and they are being introduced to it through my book. And so that's also been a really interesting and unexpected experience. But yeah, this is a very real disaster, and a lot of people locally are really involved in community preparation, and so it is speculative fiction, and in some ways, it's like it's nonfiction, and that's been an interesting dance.
I'm still trying to come to terms with this. So there's like a 37% chance that this massive earthquake is going to come. It's going to rip through Portland, Oregon. Untold disaster. People are going to be dying, injured, and yet everyone's still living there.
Is that not an analogy for climate change? Should we not now talk about the state of Florida and large parts of California, Phoenix, Arizona? I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about sort of what it means to live under the shadow of something coming and the ways that our brains, like, really, we just cannot prepare for that. And that is also kind of an analogy for pregnancy. And that became, as I wrote the book, became more and more important to me, that there is sort of this question of, like, why have a child? Why bring a child? Not even just into, like, the modern world, because that's a little bit of a tired argument at this point, but just like, why bring a child, A, a child that is so fragile and so precious. Why step into the suffering and awe that life contains? And that became a larger question that I think Annie then is really trying to answer as she walks.
I feel like you were reading my mind as we go into the next question because I wanted to go straight into this idea of you also really dig into motherhood and you just open up in the book to all of the fears, the insecurities, the sort of disaster that could be motherhood, but also the beauty that could be parenthood. How did you get yourself into that mindset, to get all of that onto the page?
I mean, it helped that I was writing it with with a very new baby. It was fresh in my mind. Though as the years have passed, it has become harder and harder to sort of remember what it was like to be pregnant enough to sort of work on this book. And, I think when I was pregnant, I really felt like there was so much talk about preparation and really that was a consumer discussion. I felt like, oh, being pregnant is a consumer identity created by advertisers and I am now sort of being expected to play this role and I felt so isolated when I was pregnant. I was really wanting to talk more deeply about what it means to make human life. I hate saying this out loud, but it is the truth. I really felt like, oh, one day my kid is going to die and I'm going to die. And how do you love something really intensely that is not that is impermanent? And it was sort of all that I could think about. I was like one of those real sort of grim pregnant ladies. And there just was very little out there that I could find that spoke to what I was thinking or going through, and started to just feel this, like, yeah, incredible disconnect, and that's, I think, what I really wanted to capture.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Emma Pattee, and you are listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Emma's brand new debut novel, Tilt. On the surface, this book is about a woman, Annie, who's 37 weeks pregnant, and she's standing in IKEA when the big earthquake hits. And throughout the rest of the book, we see her walking across Portland, Oregon to find her husband. And we go back and forth between the past and the present to really hear about how she got there. So that's sort of the surface level. But Emma, what is this book really about?
Yeah, I think the book for me, I would not have said this when I started writing it, but the book really became an exploration of shock points and this idea that sometimes we're all really stuck. A lot of us are very stuck and we're very sort of parked in our corner of life. And sometimes there's like a shock point and it gives you the chance to see things so clearly. You stop caring about your Peloton and like your employee badge doesn't work and it's sort of at the end of the world, right? We're all going to see clearly and maybe become our truer selves. And as I wrote, and also as I dug into the research behind disaster, it really became clear to me that this is a very real phenomenon, that we have a chance to see things clearly. And that often what we see is the importance of community and connection. And, that really, the book really ended up being a woman's journey from a real isolated, sort of modern day state frame of mind to a much more animalistic, communal, connected way of being.
In the book, Annie, the main character, her shock point is she's about to give birth, but also there's the earthquake. She doesn't know what is left of her life. And for me, she kept asking, or I kept thinking for her, what's next? Can I start over? Can I start over? And I felt like she was looking back on her life saying, okay, maybe I made some bad turns, but maybe I can do better going forward.
Yeah, Annie's a really stuck person, and I had when I started writing this book, I had seen this as a very millennial experience, and people have since come up to me and said this is not just a millennial experience, but I do think there is a very millennial m right now experience of starting to get into your 40s and thinking like, "Oh, this is it. This was it? Okay." And, kind of the dream, the star child dream being realized in something that's maybe a little bit pedestrian. And I wanted to give Annie a second chance, and I really felt like somebody that's stuck, the only thing that can shake them out of it, like even a kid is not shaking Annie out of her stuckness and out of her feeling that things should be better than they are. And so I felt like the only true thing that could give Annie a second chance is something as dismantling as an earthquake.
Right, so Annie had this dream when she was younger that she would be a very famous playwright, that she would become a star, like literally a star, and it didn't happen. And then she's going to give birth, she's going to have this husband, this other life, but it's not really happening in this dreamy way either for her, and so she's walking across Portland, and she's not really a hero, she's even a little unpleasant, but I loved her. And I don't know how to reconcile all those things, so I wanted to hear, like, how did you think about Annie?
Yeah, it's funny. People I think reading the book and interviewing me assume that Annie is me. And I'm so different from Annie. I have this almost like annoying eternal optimism, this kind of labradoodle energy. And so I am really different and I can kind of make the best out of any situation, sometimes like really to a fault. There was something very sad about writing a character that felt like all the doors had shut when I could see clearly that she has so many doors still open and that, 35 is not, like, the end of your life. And so for me, there was something that felt really sad about that, and to sort of see the ways in which that happens, and that's something I feel very intimate with, especially having I went to school on the East Coast, I went to school in Boston, I came back home after, and so I have really seen a lot of my artist friends graduating to the recession and trying to make it work, and I have seen what's happened with when the tech boom hit Portland. Portland, the housing prices here have just gone insane. The whole city has changed in this really profound way. And there's all these forces outside of Annie's control, right? Like they don't have medical insurance, and her husband has a dental emergency. And you can just sort of see this happen, and her mother dies of COVID very early on. And I felt such compassion for her that all she sees is a dead end. And I felt so clearly that she deserved an open door.
She saw a dead end, but she kept walking.
She does keep walking.
So in the Hollywood version of your debut novel, Tilt, Annie would be a hero in some way. She would save a child or a person, or, you can imagine big explosive scenes where she does something huge. But in your book, you don't have any of those moments. Why not?
Yeah, it's really important to me. There is a cultural narrative around disaster that has been very much stolen by narratives like Mad Max, or like The Road would be a key example of that. And it's kind of like at the end of the world, man with gun walks alone and is a hero, right? And like, I mean, I think I recently went through The Road, and I think it's like 300 and something pages long, and there's like 4 pages that women appear on. And I was just so like, how can a book win a Pulitzer and be sort of seen as this Bible of economic breakdown and basically erase women as having a role? I was speaking a couple years ago to the novelist Karen Russell, who has a really beautiful book out right now. And she talked about how we make things real by just repeating the narrative enough. There's almost an obligation to present a different narrative. And that sometimes when we've seen the narrative enough, we're like, but that actually is true, but only because we've seen the narrative, not because it's actually true. And so it was so important to me to write against that. And just after an earthquake, at the end of the world, during climate breakdown, nobody is going to be walking alone with a gun and somehow save the day. It's not true. It's not supported by the historical record. It's not supported by human behavioral psychology. It's also not even appealing to me to present that or think about that. So I very early on got excited about this idea of a feminist retelling of The Road, and it much more being about community, it much more being about humans working together. After the earthquake, Annie really craves just physical closeness. There's science that supports that, and she's always looking to see what other people are doing. And that again is supported by science. And so it was so important that I show something different and actually more accurate.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Emma Pattee, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, Tilt. In this novel, we have a main character, Annie, who is 37 weeks pregnant, and she is terrified of becoming a mother. She's not sure what she's supposed to do, what it's going to be like, if she should even be pregnant at the moment. And the book is written as a stream of consciousness where she's talking to this child still in the womb, and she calls this child Bean. And she goes to a prenatal yoga class at one point and just spills her secrets. And could you read them for us?
Sure. Tell your baby what's on your mind, the teacher says, her voice lilting as if she's reading a poem out loud. And that's the problem, see? That's the whole problem. The things on my mind aren't fit for a fetus to hear. The things on my mind are how much my lower back hurts, and how we don't even have the money to have a baby, much less feed a baby, much less house a baby, much less pay somebody to watch said baby. And when people said it was expensive to have a baby, I thought they were just talking about clothes and bottles and cribs and stuff. I didn't think they literally meant the birth was expensive. and I should probably just call the clinic and ask if we can have a payment plan. And then I think, yes, in fact, I should do that right now. Just get it over with. Just stop avoiding the things that make me uncomfortable, like money. You know what? Maybe I'll just call them, just check it off the to-do list. And then I open my phone to call, but there's an Instagram notification. And 20 minutes pass where I'm just scrolling through picture after picture of people I don't know and friends I haven't spoken to in years and old coworkers and women who used to date your dad's friends.
That stream of consciousness, I just love this is what I loved about this book, your debut, Tilt, which is, "What am I doing?" And that's a brave thing for someone to admit they're thinking when they're pregnant, because I feel like there's so much pressure on women to outwardly be excited to have a child, whereas inwardly, maybe the truth isn't just excitement.
Yeah, stream of consciousness has existed in this book from the very beginning. It was always really important to me. And, something from a journalistic background was really interesting is that when you read more about people after disaster and how quickly they revert back to sort of the ridiculous stuff that they were thinking before, or just the ridiculous things people would tell themselves when like really bad things are happening. And I really was fascinated by and wanted to capture that sort of like monkey mind. We just have these like bizarre brains that are just constantly spinning narratives. And so I really wanted to show that. And then, of course, that exists in pregnancy as well, where we culturally see there's like a proper way to think about things or to be. And then there's like actually what's happening behind the curtain. An element of writing this book is that I wrote this book thinking that nobody would ever read it. And when I was writing this book, a lot of people were like, this is a weird book idea. This is not a great book idea. And so part of it too is that I think it's easier to write stream of consciousness when you really believe that no one's ever going to read it. And, I just have had the very fortunate and at times, disturbing experience of it really becoming this book and a lot of people reading the book. And, thank goodness that when I wrote it, I truly believed that nobody would read it. Otherwise, I don't know that I would have been as willing uh to be as honest about what I think is going on in people's minds.
Right, because there's the outward appearance of pregnancy and a woman saying she's excited and happy, and then there's the inner turmoil of, "What am I doing? What am I getting into?" And in this moment where she is her most vulnerable, she's about to become a parent, there's that she's on the precipice of that, but she's also vulnerable and that she can't defend her own body because she's 37 weeks pregnant, and that adds a whole other layer to this disaster. Annie is trying to cross Portland, and it's dangerous, and she doesn't even have her usual strength. That, to me, really, really scared me.
Yeah, I mean, she does. She thinks sort of honestly about, the possibility of being raped and if being pregnant, would or wouldn't make that less or more likely. And she starts thinking about like serial killers that she's read about and trying to kind of remember the advice you're supposed to get people to like help you or not rape you or not kill you. And she can't quite remember the advice because it was all sort of like from Instagram years ago. So, yeah, I really wanted to show that kind of like unfiltered thinking on a more personal level. When I was pregnant, I had prenatal depression, which is like postpartum depression, but you get it early. And I had never heard of it. It actually is fairly common. And I think it's a hard, it's a very disorienting experience because we do now talk a lot about postpartum depression, but nobody was speaking about this. And I had no idea what was happening. I knew that I am naturally a very happy-go-lucky, positive person. I wake up every day pretty pumped, and I was waking up, and I really couldn't even place what joy would feel like or why I would want to be alive. Like, I couldn't it was like a something someone had told me that had slipped out of my brain. I couldn't quite catch it, and it was very disorienting, and I felt like I must just not want to have a kid. The core truth of me must be that I don't wanna have a kid, which was really confusing because 'cause I'd obviously tried to have a kid in the regular ways that people try to have kids. And, we had chosen to have a kid, and here I was pregnant, and I felt like I can't tell anybody. This will be this horrible reveal that I am kind of actually must be a really, really bad mother from day one because I'm not excited. And I basically kinda white knuckled it through, about 6 months of pregnancy before I told anybody. And it was, one of the most challenging experiences of my life. And I think that that experience of understanding that I was feeling the wrong feelings and thinking the wrong thoughts, and that I had to fake, and that each moment required a certain type of performative experience, right? Like a baby shower requires a certain performance. Telling your parents, telling your friends, announcing on, so like these things require a performance, and that I really did need to nail the performance while I was having this completely other experience. I think I wanted to really show that, and to sort of write some of that into the book. And Annie's not somebody that has prenatal depression, and she has more external reasons for the way she feels, but I wanted to show how isolating that type of dissonance is. And to be honest, the more I started to talk about it, the more people were like, "Well, I felt that too." And then started to feel horrible, like we're all participating in this giant charade of pregnant joy that then obligates the next person to participate.
Wow. I was not expecting that answer. That was very powerful and very honest, just like the book, just like your debut tilt. If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Emma Pattee. You are listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about the brand new debut novel, Tilt. Another big piece of the book is Annie's husband, Dom. He's called a star who forgot to become a star. He thought that he would break into Hollywood and maybe do that disaster movie himself. Tell us about Dom.
Yeah, Dom's such a divisive character. People really love him or they hate him. It does seem to split across generational lines, which is really fascinating. I think, as the conversation's shifting around equity in the home and division of labor and emotional labor. When I started writing this book, I really felt like Dom needs to get it together, right? Like, come on, dude, give up your dream and you're going to be a dad, get it together. And the years I've spent with this man and with this book, I really have, and where I think a journey that Annie is on with the way she perceives Dom is kind of a true affection of someone that just keeps reaching, of someone that is like, they're going to take the shot, they're going to try. And it is funny as Annie, in the beginning, Annie is really rooted in like, you need to be sensible. We need to pay bills. And that is true. But as, the world just starts to fall apart around Annie, and as everything that she counted on is destabilizing, she is realizing, God, why not keep reaching? And so her sort of even understanding of Dom is shifting as she's moving through this book. And yeah, it is funny. Annie's very much not based on me, but I definitely gave Dom many of my best and worst characteristics. And so I selfishly do have a deep affection for him. And man, people really hate him. The amount of people who are like, I hope the husband doesn't make it. It's like, oh my gosh.
I love Dom.
Rachel.
Eternally optimistic, right? He is the dreamer. I can still do this, and I I love that he holds on to that. I did.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rachel, but nobody agrees with us, so I don't go on Goodreads where Dom is hated, and I think in some ways, rightfully so. I think in a lot of ways, rightfully so.
I've loved that you've touched on this idea that Annie's feelings for her husband Dom change as she walks, for longer and longer and further, and you wrote it so well in the book. Would you read for us?
Of course. This is actually something one of the first, this is from very early on, an early draft. One of the pieces, just that specific paragraph is one of the things that made it in. When we get home, I'm unlocking the front door before I notice that your father is still sitting in the passenger seat, in the driveway, staring at the garage door. I call back to him, and he slowly looks over to me and nods. Like the weight of all of his disappointment is a sack of sand on top of him, holding him down in the car seat. And I guess in hindsight, I could have gone back out, could have sat with him there in the car, could have turned on the radio and started singing to lighten the mood, could have suggested a movie or ice cream or anything. But I did none of that. People will tell you that everything is clear in hindsight, but really it's just rewritten. In hindsight, I was full of care and kindness, not tired or cranky at all, and I ran back to the car to hold his hand and comfort him. In hindsight, he was not petulant or sullen, but instead a stoic hunk of a man who cried a single tear that reflected from the light of the moon. In hindsight, he wasn't even disappointed. He was already a famous actor. I go in the house and put on a pot of water to make spaghetti for dinner.
I just thought that passage was heartbreaking and again, so real and so honest because she knew in the moment, Annie knew in the moment that maybe she should have gone back to him. But she's thinking about spaghetti, right? She's also thinking about what she has to do to go forward. And then it just sticks with her this moment. And I love that you said this was actually in one of the very early drafts of the book. So it seems like it was very powerful for you too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it now. I just had sort of that such a memory of writing it, so many years ago, like 2 or 3 houses ago, and sitting and writing it. Yeah, I think that something that is in this book is the concept of a long marriage, and there's not a lot of millennials that have been with their partners. That's not always a common thing. But I really wanted to write about the way after sort of 10 years or so, when you truly have, like, grown up together, that there can be this real fracturing, and there is a moment where you're like, "How much of this person's baggage am I gonna continue to carry?" It is a really beautiful thing to meet someone when you're young and you have all these dreams, and then to get to realize those dreams together. I mean, is there anything more beautiful? And also when it is conversely that, I think, devastating to meet somebody who has a lot of dreams and then show up in your 30s with some pretty profound regrets and disappointments, and you start to kinda carry those as well for each other, and so I want Annie, now that she's pregnant, is, I think, trying to peel apart how much of his ambition and his disappointment she's gonna keep carrying.
So, I already told you that I love dreams, right? I love Dom that he has these dreams, and I love that Annie has these dreams. But on another level, everyone has a dream as a kid. I'm gonna go on a rocket up to the moon. I'm gonna join NASA, or I'm gonna be, the Hollywood star. And Dom just never gets over that or, moves on to a more realistic dream in a sense. Why did you make him as a character holding on to that dream of the Hollywood fame?
Yeah, I think that it's my certainly my own path. I always wanted to be a writer. I went to school for writing. I sort of thought I would be this very famous writer, and then I graduated in the recession, and I gave it up, and really had a sort of an actual breakup with it. On a specific day, said I'm done with this dream, and started working in marketing. So glamorous, and so I think that I really wanted to write about this decision that I think a lot of artists have to make, sometimes over and over again, which is like, how do you know when it's time to put the dream down? And having a kid is a real natural time for that. It certainly was my experience. Like, getting pregnant, I was like, oh, I might not ever write a book. So I wanted to kind of show that. And I also wanted to show that, I think that Annie holds a lot of morality around her, like, sensibility, but that actually, as the book goes on, you start to sort of question, like, is that moral, or is she just afraid to take a shot? And he's doing, he's doing the thing. He does the thing. And so I think that, and even piecing apart too, that, I think Annie in some ways is more interested in being famous. And I think in some ways Dom is, he's just chasing the thing he loves to do. So, about halfway through writing this book, I went and saw Tick Tick Boom. And there was here, they staged it at Portland Center Stage, and there's this beautiful song, and he says, "What a way to spend the day." And I was, like, so taken with that. Like, "Oh, man, life is so short." Like, it's such a w like, art is such an incredible way to spend the day, and what a really beautiful, humble look at making art, and I wonder if Dom would maybe resonate with that more than Annie would.
I love that you brought up Jonathan Larson's Tick, Tick, Boom because I absolutely love that show, and it is, similar to your book, it is a portrait of an artist saying, "When do I put the dream down? Do I put the dream down? Can I live with the dream?" And I think why I loved your book, Tilt, so much is because I still felt like there was a part of Annie and Dom, obviously, but Annie too, that wasn't willing to quite put it down. She was saying, "Okay, I've gotta pay the rent. I still have to do this, but I still wanna hold on to that dream."
Yeah, I mean, there's a part in the book, where she talks about this, like, wanting to be famous is like a rash, and just when you think it's gone away, it pops up again, and it's just so red and so itchy, and yes, that was really key for me to show, and there's another, Tick, Tick, Boom is incredibly important to me, into this book, because at the time, the editor I was working with for this book, before the book sold, told me to cut all the ambition stuff out of the book and all the art stuff out of the book, but it didn't add anything. And so I had done that. And just to focus on sort of the earthquake and more of like domestic tale of marriage and motherhood and stuff. And then I went to see Tick Tick Boom, and I that night was like, "No, no, no. The book has ambition in it. It has art in it, or I'm not writing it," and put all of it back in. So that truly that show really changed this book. And there's a song where he says, "How do you know when it's time to let go?" And I probably listened to that song like 1,000 times writing this book. I would just on repeat listen to it because it's so much captured something that sort of until that point I don't know that I had had words for.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Emma Pattee, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, Tilt. Emma, in your debut, Tilt, the main character, Annie, is 37 weeks pregnant and she is walking across Portland, Oregon after the massive earthquake. And it felt like a real journey. I felt like you had taken this journey, that you have walked this path. How real is her walk across the city?
I have walked that path many, many, many times over the years. Portland is changing so fast that as I was writing, sometimes buildings that were in the book were getting torn down and rebuilt. So I'd have to go edit the book as the new buildings were coming up. So, yeah, I mean, this is a real earthquake and it is coming. And I think very early on, I came to this from a place of earthquake anxiety. There's a lot of people in my life that have a lot of earthquake anxiety. There was no way I was going to sensationalize something in a way that would scare people just to scare them. And so it's really important to me that every part of this book is grounded in fact. I really set out to write a nonfiction book as it relates to the earthquake. So every street in the book is real. Every building that she sees is real. The destruction to the bridges, the length of the shaking, what the condition of the roads, like all of that is what is forecasted to happen. And I worked with a geologist. I also hired a grad student, and we sort of came up with an actual earthquake magnitude, and we picked the season it happened in so that we could know the soil conditions, because soil conditions are a big predictor of destruction in earthquakes. And so it was that important to me that every aspect of this be really accurate. And I met with first responders who are on site in Kashmir and in China, and who did rescues in collapsed buildings there. And I interviewed city officials. So certainly my intention is that someone who is reading this book, surely just from an informative place, would feel like they are given a pretty accurate understanding of what the earthquake would be like and would feel like.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Annie's mother. Annie feels very alone. She feels the loss of her mother acutely. Her mother died during COVID, and her mother was also a failed artist. And you see that shadow throughout the book. Tell us about Annie's mother.
It's funny. My mom lives about 10 minutes from here, and I was just at her house for her birthday party, and she's telling all of her friends, "The mother in the book is amazing. The mother in the book is the best mother." She just really wants people to know that the mother in the book is a wonderful mother, and she is. And when I was writing this book, I was very aware of the fact that my mother was a writer who wanted to write books, and my grandmother was a writer who wanted to write books, and her mother wanted to be an opera singer. I was very aware of the weight of kind of generational ambition that could not be realized for systemic reasons, and the way that that sat now in me. And I wanted to, this book in many ways is like an homage to my mother and my grandmother, and just like a legacy of women that had a lot to say and didn't really have a platform to say it. And I wanted to show that, in Annie's relationship with her mother, Annie, of course, is this millennial star child who everyone thinks is going to be famous and isn't. And her mother is this, small town Oregon lady who's very practical, but then and who would never consider herself an artist, much less a failed artist, but then of course does have this passion and this art, and takes it so seriously. And I wanted to show that. I wanted to show the kind of dedication you can give something at the same time that you're saying, "Oh, this silly thing, this little hobby." And that the art, she makes these little paper mache birds that are perfectly accurate. And that really became such a big theme in the book, which is why there's a bird on the cover.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Emma Pattee, and you are listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Emma's brand new debut novel, Tilt. Sticking with this theme of motherhood, at the end of the book, we see Annie go into labor, and she's in the woods, and she's all alone, and it is this terrifying, terrifying moment, and I understand that comes from maybe something you experienced.
Really, it took me a couple years before I could figure out how the book was gonna end because it almost felt impossible to make a decision about, like, who gets to live and who gets to die and who gets to be saved, and I wanted the decision to come from a place of a lot of clarity about what I was trying to say and what I was trying to do for Annie, and I had this experience during COVID. I was in Lake Tahoe with my husband. We were hiking, and our kiddo was about a year and a half old, and he was on the little carrier on my husband's back, and this man comes running towards us, and he's like, "Quick, turn around. There's a really large bear following me on this path." We've already been hiking for hours. It's really hot. We're getting like sunburned and we're like, go. And we start walking really fast in the other direction. And I say to my husband, "You have the baby on your back. You go ahead as fast as you can. And I will walk slow and I'll take up the rear. And that way, if the bear is going to attack somebody, it'll attack me and we'll create this, really big distance between the bear and our child." And he was like, "Bye, like, been nice knowing you, baby," and, like, turned around and sort of booked it in the other direction, and we've been married a long time. When I think about that, it really was sort of one of the most lovely moments I have of our parenting connection, because we really saw each other in that moment, that he knew I was serious and that he was on the exact same page, and we were not performing parenthood, which goes back to what you and I were talking about earlier about performing pregnancy. Like, there was no performance of martyrdom, that we didn't have time to think. It was like the first thing out of my mouth. And as I saw him sort of disappearing around the corner up ahead with my kid bobbing on the back, I just felt so much relief and joy. And my only fear was sort of the relational distance between baby and bear. And the bear did not get me. But at the end of that day, driving back to our hotel, I was like, "Oh, I understand the ending of this book." And the ending is about that. It's about sort of this a fierceness you step into when you become a parent that is not performative and that is biological, and that I really think is sort of the core of what we talk about when we talk about, like, that the universe is made of love, or it is the truest, sharpest form of love, is that protective impulse.
You bring that out very clearly, and I really loved that in the ending, but the ending is also sort of a cliffhanger because we're not really sure who's gonna survive, what's going to happen, what comes next, and I can imagine there's a real love-hate for that. I actually loved it because I, in my head, imagined all these things happening, and, like, the book continued for me, and I have closed it in my own mind. I don't know how you would have done it, but I did it. But I can imagine that other readers would probably have a real love-hate for that. Have you found that?
So much hate, which is so funny because in my mind, it's not a cliffhanger. I'm like, it's incredibly obvious who has made it and who has not made it. But I think that's maybe because I've researched it and also because maybe that bring up a rational nihilism to that. I don't know. But yeah, I have been getting so many emails from people asking me to tell them what happens, that they can't sleep until they know who has made it or not. Even from other authors have written me saying, like, I just have to know, did so and so, what happened with so and so. And yeah, my intention would never be to give somebody like an unsatisfying ending, but the ending, I have to say, it satisfied me. Do you know? And that was what I had to do. I had to write an ending that I had to land the jump. And I landed the jump the way that I needed to, and Annie, that gave Annie the thing that she didn't have before. But I am always delighted to meet someone who just hates my ending. It doesn't upset me. I really, yeah, I love the divisiveness, and I love that for some people, they're like, "Oh, it's very obvious what happened." And for others, they're like, "How could you not tell us what happened?" Yeah, that speaks to sort of how our brains can process disaster.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Emma Pattee. We're talking about her brand new debut novel, Tilt. Emma, this book is written as a stream of consciousness. I don't read many books that are written that way. How did you get into that, and did you get a lot of pushback on that?
No, when I sold the book to Mary Sue Ritchie, who's my editor at Simon& Schuster, the book was fairly close to how it is now, and she really saw in it the vision of what I was trying to do. So I didn't get any pushback about the stream of consciousness. I think, from sort of the beginning, people either really connect with Annie and Annie's voice, or they really don't. And I've just had the beautiful opportunity to work with a lot of people who really connect with Annie.
You've said that writing this book was a journey for you in learning how to make decisions as a writer. Can you tell me about that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think when I started writing, I was a little newbie and I felt like everything about a book should come from this sort of inspired place and that you like would write and that you would just be like, and I got to know this character and he appeared to me in the ether and I was very taken with all this like real kind of grandiose language around like art and character building and world building and plot and, through working, I worked really closely with a writing coach for a couple of years. And just through rewriting this book, I've probably written about 18 times. I really came to see that book writing is just a series of decisions, big and small. And you have to make the decision as a writer. And I think in general, you do make the decision from a pretty conscious place and not a sort of muse filled place. And for me, each decision really came to be, what am I trying to say? And does this decision reflect that? And I don't mean so much like there's a message to this book or there's a moral to the book, but I really think, my journey as a writer in general has been claiming the art, stepping away from some of the language around like writer's block and muses and inspiration and talent and stepping more into consistency, dedication, commitment to the craft and sort of commitment to the book project itself.
This novel, Tilt, is your debut. You are a novelist, full-on novelist at this point, published novelist. You are also a climate journalist, and I imagine those are very different parts of your brain that you use, or at least they have different products. So I want to ask you about how you move from one role to the other and how you see them connecting in ways.
Yeah, climate journalism is really what I feel is like a type of a calling for me. It's more of a moral calling. Writing is my favorite thing to do. Truly, creative writing is my favorite thing to do, and I would not say climate journalism is my favorite thing to do. It's real heavy work. For me, the craft of journalism and the craft of writing are sort of such different things. It's almost hard. I always sort of compare them to, and journalists I'm sure hate this, to like chopping wood or like a tennis swing. And so like when you chop wood, you're trying to get the wood chopped. And that's more speaks to my journalistic talent. And there's a lot of incredibly talented journalists. I would say I'm just a wood chopping journalist. My goal is to get that wood chopped and to make some change in the world. And then for me, creative writing is more like tennis, and that with the way you perfect that swing, just that kind of insatiable interest in trying to improve, where there isn't really an end result that is about making the world a better place. So the two things live very separately for me, but they're certainly both fueled by, my curiosity and by what I see happening around me.
Do you want your reader to put this book down and be thinking about the big earthquake and the impending climate disasters that we may be facing? Or do you want us talking more about pregnancy and impending parenthood?
My hope for anyone reading this book, I was very taken writing this with people talking about 9/11 and how they would be like walking home after 9/11 and they would have these realizations like, I'm quitting that job. Or like, I met a woman just last week who told me that on that walk, she knew that she would marry the man that she was walking with, and they're still married. So for me, the thing I'm trying to impart is this idea that there's still time to change your life and you don't have to wait for an earthquake. You can just for 20 something dollars, you can read about an earthquake and there's still time to change your life. And that's what Annie gets as well.
Emma Pattee, thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out.
Thank you, Rachel. It was wonderful to be here.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. I'll be back next week with Rob Franklin and his brand new debut novel, Great Black Hope. Make sure to check this out. Our producer today is Jessica Hunt. Penn Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by C&S Wholesale Grocers family of companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all the books you hear about here and love. Thanks for listening. See you next time.